Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld, and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Colin Khoury, Senior Director of Science and Conservation at the San Diego Botanic Garden. Colin was born and raised in the coastal sage scrub and the avocado and citrus orchards of San Diego County. He obtained a Master's of Science in Plant Genetic Resource Conservation from the University of Birmingham, UK, and a PhD in Production Ecology and Resource Conservation from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. He has held science and conservation positions at academic, nonprofit, industry, government, and international organizations across the US and in Italy and Colombia. Colin is thrilled to be back home working for the conservation and use of plant diversity for people and for the planet. Thank you so much for being here today, Colin.
Thanks. So excited to be with you.
Great. So we'll kick off with a few questions here. So what is the San Diego Botanic Garden and what type of work does it do?
Sure. The San Diego Botanic Garden is a public garden, one of many hundreds across the United States that is a place where people can come and recreate and feel safe outdoors and learn about plants, sometimes about animals, pollinators, climate change, land use issues, all kinds of challenges and biodiversity wonders that surround plants. The San Diego Botanic Garden is a unique little garden in the North County of San Diego along the coast. It has a long history, over 50 years, that grew up out of being well, first of all, just a small piece of land that some folks who loved plants had. And then they gave it over to the county of San Diego when they got older and wanted it to stay around so that people could access it and recreate it. And it was originally called the Quail Botanical Garden because the donor, the person who gave it over to the county of San Diego, loved our California quail, which run around still within the garden space here. And so this garden, like all public gardens, of course, has changed and evolved over time. And so it grew up from simply a park that the county of San Diego tried to run as a free place, but then quickly realized over a decade or so that it was very difficult to run a place that had a lot of plants growing in it that needed a lot of care. And so little by little, a nonprofit organization grew up around that now is called the San Diego Botanic Garden, that has grown to over 50 staff, a very large program that does the gardens itself, that is maintaining 37 acres of plants from around the world. We also do science and conservation, which I'm the director of, and a lot of education and outreach programs, both for adults and for children.
That sounds awesome. I've actually been to the San Diego Botanic Garden. I lived in San Diego briefly. But what are some of the things that people can see there if they were to explore your gardens?
Absolutely. This garden is really, truly a global journey. You can visit parts of Australia and New Zealand, deserts from the Eastern Hemisphere, from the Western Hemisphere, very tropical regions. And we now have a wonderful indoor conservancy space, conservatory space, where the most sensitive tropical species can also be displayed and have education on. Even though we're in Southern California, where you can grow just about everything, we need a little bit of protection, a glass house, to be able to grow the most sensitive tropical species, for instance. My two favorite places of the garden are actually our natural areas, where we display and conserve native vegetation from coastal northern San Diego County, which is just about gone simply due to the number of people that love to live here along the coast. And so there are, it's a whole habitat called Southern Maritime Chaparral that is endangered in of itself, and then hundreds of species that are in themselves threatened. And we have trails that wander through those, including an area that is dedicated to interpreting and educating about the native peoples that lived and still live in this region.
That sounds incredible. Can you tell me a little bit about your background and what sparked your interest in food, agriculture, and horticulture?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. I, as you mentioned, grew up around here and just inland in an area that was settled by folks who wanted to grow plants, agriculturalists or horticulturalists, and became a major citrus and avocado region. I grew up right on the edge of agriculture, of urban areas, of people living, and then of wild spaces. And which I'm grateful for. I understood even as a child that tension of needs between people and needing their housing and their economies, us needing to grow food, and then wild spaces, biodiversity and habitats for wildlife, et cetera. And even as a kid, I remember I was worried about that. And it's funny to see that as it's evolved. I mean, it's still kind of what I'm interested in and what I do. I went away to college in another part of the country in the Midwest, and I learned at that time um, how big the world was, but also how many challenges there were out there in terms of people's health and well-being, in terms of feeding the planet, and in terms of doing that in a sustainable way. It worried me actually so much that I quit college. I left college halfway through um, to become a farmer. And that was a big guess. I didn't particularly know about farming, even though I grew up around it. And we had a lot of fruit orchards on our property. And I lucked out because it turned out that I liked growing plants and enjoyed the whole issue around feeding myself and others. And I feel also very lucky that that happened. Um, it turned out I still had my intellectual interests, and so I came back around after several years to finishing a degree there. And in the meantime, I got more interested, let's say, in seeds and the diversity within agriculture than purely production. And that's absolutely nothing to say negative about producers. I mean, in many ways, farmers are my heroes in terms of the challenge of, again, of growing food for people. But I just got into the diversity itself, and particularly the stuff I could see immediately, like beans and just the colors and variation. And so I started working for some small seed companies and nonprofit organizations, including in the Southwest, that were attempting to take care of old seed varieties, what we call heirloom varieties, in the United States and in Mexico. And that, I think, really confirmed this deep interest in diversity within agriculture and what we eat, and also that connection to people, that diversity is meaningful to communities and to whole traditions of people going back hundreds and even thousands of years. Um, that led eventually to a master's in essentially seed banking and taking care of those seeds, and then a PhD, largely in the same, essentially trying to figure out where that diversity is out there in the world in terms of in farmers' fields where they still grow heirloom or what are called landrace varieties around the world, and then also now more focused on the wild cousins or the wild relatives of crops, um, things like wild potatoes and wild sunflowers, and where they grow as native wild plants, and how well they're doing in the wild, and how much we've already collected them and placed them in the seed banks so that we can look at them and eventually bring in interesting traits like pest and disease resistance or cold or heat tolerance into our crops. Um, that journey has taken me around the world over several decades in South America and in Europe and the Caribbean, and eventually come back home in this giant circle to the place that I have to admit I feel the deepest connection to and the deep love to both the native plants and the agriculture here. So I'm very excited to be home.
I love that. That's great that you were able to return. Can you tell me a little bit about your role as the Senior Director of Science and Conservation at the San Diego Botanic Garden?
Thank you. Yeah. For those who aren't particularly familiar with gardens, I'd like to say that I am also new. I've moved over essentially from agriculture into this big botanic garden world just in the last few years. And as I've learned it, I've learned that gardens differ a lot. And so there is a there's a classic garden tradition of places like the Missouri Botanical Garden or New York Botanical Garden that were very large estates, well planned, long programs, and have hundreds of scientists or researchers working on all kinds of issues there. The San Diego Botanic Garden, in many ways, is almost the opposite of that. It is a small, uh, very organically grown up garden. I mean that in the sense that it wasn't inherited with a big estate that already had planning around it. It didn't particularly have a lot of money. It was dedicated plant lovers who wanted to develop. And so there's parts of this garden that were developed by the Southern California Rare Fruit Growers Association with neat types of guavas and even mangoes and bananas and all kinds of neat stuff like that. There are areas of people who loved tropical feeling. So they built a waterfall and all kinds of neat palms from around the world. And so all of that came together with staff and then hundreds, literally hundreds of volunteers and docents over years and years. Um, Gardens have typically, in the last couple of decades, started to take on a role more serious about trying to make a difference, not only in the garden itself, but in the wider community and regionally or even globally around plant matters like sustainability or human health. And this garden is doing that too, part of which I developed a science and conservation program, which I was hired and came on to start. So it was also this incredible gift to, from the beginning, create something based on what we know how to do, which is fundamentally grow plants, and what we can do then for the community of San Diego, of this border region, and then beyond. And so what that has evolved in about 3 years is focus on three main areas, which are our native plants. And I'd like to mention that this border region, Southern California, is it's a really interesting area for biodiversity. It's the county with the most biodiversity in the United States, including Hawaii, of most metrics, not just plants, but birds and many other metrics. It's also the county with the most threatened amount of species. And it's also the county, actually, with two other things, with the most Native American nations and the most small farmers. And of course, there's places all over the United States and beyond that are wonderful places to work and important things to do. This is one of them that there's plenty to do around conservation of that biodiversity and how humans interact with that and how we can all somehow possibly get along a little bit better in the future. And so our first focus is on those native plants of this region. Our second focus is around medicinal plants. And that's an emerging program of really reinvigorating an interest in natural products, in what plants themselves and the natural products that derive from them can do for people. And there's this wave of decades where there's a lot of interest in natural product discovery, and then it kind of goes down, and the focus is really on more synthetic, what you can create out of chemicals just known in the lab, and then it comes back up. And we're trying to reinvigorate an interest here in this region in that natural product research. It's going quite well so far. And then the third area is food and agricultural research, which is celebrating this tremendous diversity of thousands of plants that we eat, and trying to keep around the ones that are disappearing.
Yeah, I'm amazed by all of the programs that you have going on at San Diego Botanic Garden. I think most people, yeah, would be surprised by how many areas you're exploring. And it's really exciting. What role can botanic gardens in general play in conserving a diverse food and agricultural system?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, well, so one answer to that is that the origin of botanic gardens themselves was actually a focus on food and agricultural plants, on medicinal plants, on other plants directly important to people. And that is, the very first botanic gardens around the world were focused on the plants that could do the most for people. And um, over time, those gardens became more pleasure gardens, more about beauty and ornament. And then with increasing concerns about environment, about sustainability, they over the last 50 years, let's say, or 70 years, have focused a lot on conservation. But that said, they're coming back around to this focus again on their origins, which is on these plants that are so important to us for our sustenance and our medicine and others. And why that is, I think, is multifaceted. I think I guess it's in our DNA, so to speak, to be interested in the things closest to us. But also, I think that perhaps there is an increasing understanding that everybody needs to get involved as some of these challenges become ever more real. And those challenges that I mean are more people on the planet having reasonable expectations of a good quality of life and a finite planet, and increasing contamination and pollution and all kinds of other things. And so botanic gardens, I think, have realized that they have a role there. And being from the outside and coming in, I do see that role in complement to areas that I was formerly in, for instance, in agricultural research and in these seed banks, which are run by the government, for instance, the USDA here in the United States, or by international organizations like the one I lived and worked in Colombia. And so what do botanic gardens do that are different from what they do? Well, one thing is those seed banks really focus mostly on the crops that we eat the most and know. And so there's collections in the USDA of beans, for instance, of 40,000 different varieties of beans that are up there in Washington State, and of wheat even more, and all of that. So um, you have a tremendous amount of diversity within species, tons of what they call accessions, or you might call populations or varieties. What botanic gardens do that complements that is a ridiculous amount of species. And so uh, there's the ability to have these landscapes where there are thousands. For instance, here at the San Diego Botanic Garden, there's about 6,000 different plant species that are cultivated here. So we have less of the diversity within. You typically only have a couple of different varieties or types, but we have this ridiculously large amount of species diversity. And that can be neat if we really start to think about food and agriculture in a more radical way of what other foods are out there that we could eat. What could we develop into something new to address some of our challenges, or just bring more diversity into our food systems? And so I think a lot of the gardens are really trying to play a role of what would a food system look like, for instance, here in San Diego, that would be tied a little bit to maybe actually more of the native plants that haven't been developed fully into food plants, or that are just adapted to our Mediterranean climates here. And gardens would be doing that all over the world in their own way.
Could you share a little bit about some of the native plants or maybe some of these species that people might not be familiar with? And yeah, maybe how they could come across these species or try to incorporate them into their gardens or diets and things like that.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll need to give a specific example here in San Diego because this is where I know the best, but everywhere it's going to be different. And in, of course, the Eastern United States, the diversity of native plants that are there, and of course, traditional farming systems are totally different. Here in San Diego in California, it's a really interesting area. There wasn't a tremendous amount of agricultural historically. Historically, I mean, in many hundred years ago to thousands of years ago, there were many native peoples, and still are, uh, but they more managed the lands than cultivated the lands here, and it's thought in part because it was so rich anyway in food resources. So what are those food resources that are so rich? There's certainly the food from the sea that's around here, and that's wonderful. We focus less on that as a botanic garden, although are getting a little bit into marine plant research. But on the land, there are whole landscapes of wild plants that were consumed. There's our oaks, and oaks are all around, including on the eastern United States too. And one has to know how to process them, those nuts, so that they're not too bitter to eat, but a wonderful food. It's and it's right. And um, many small greens and lots of fruits, small fruits. And especially, for instance, those fruits are really interesting ones because they're already very arguably very healthy and have very little anti-nutritional components or poisons in them. Uh, Please let me clarify here that uh, there are many plants out there that are poisonous, and one shouldn't just go out and eat anything that they find out there. But what I'm saying is, here in Southern California, there are many fruits that are quite edible already for people and for wildlife. And if one could apply a little bit of science to that, to figuring out how to cultivate those, how to perhaps make the fruits a little bit bigger, easier to harvest, those sort of issues, and then there's real potential for development. We have 400,000 plant species in the world, or that have been. Many are disappearing. Only perhaps 7 or 10,000 of them are eaten, but that doesn't mean that, or have been cultivated really in some extent for eating. That doesn't mean that we've exhausted all the possibilities at all. I think humans have been ingenuous in looking at a huge diversity around the world and what's possible, but there's still much more out there.
So you touched a little bit about the fruit and nut crop varieties that are available in San Diego County. Can you share a little bit about the San Diego Botanic Garden's work with the North American Fruit and Nut Crop Wild Relative Working Group?
Sure. Yeah. So among the many initiatives of institutions that want to get together to work together on issues of sustainability in food and agriculture, there is a working group of North American fruit and nut tree crop wild relative interested people. It's a really long title or name that we shorten in the acronym to NAFANT, or NAFANT, North American Fruit and Nut Tree Crop Wild Relatives. And that group is interested in 10 different groups of species, genera of plants that are native to North America and United States, Canada, Mexico area, all of which there's a lot of native diversity here. And it's interesting because it's not that the crop that they're related to was always domesticated here. So an example of that is walnuts, juglans. And so in the United States, we have quite a diversity of wild walnuts. The main domesticated species in the world was not domesticated here. It was domesticated in Europe or West Asia. But these are cousins, kind of distant cousins. And there were, in our Native American uses, and a little bit of domestication of certain things like butternut and other things, other types of nut trees here. Our main one, if I can take a turn away from juglans for a minute, is pecans. That group of pecan nuts were domesticated here in the United States, and there is both that pecan and then there's all of its wild cousins that are also in many parts of the United States. And so those of us who are fruity or nutty and want to get into this are really just interested in what are these species and where are they living, and could they offer some different interesting traits. And so here in Southern California, we have, for instance, the Southern California walnut, Juglans californica, as well as another one that occurs a little bit further north in California called Juglans hinsii. And for those who are into horticulture, these are actually already used, or especially that hinsii species from Northern California, very regularly, very commonly used as the rootstock or the graft stock for cultivated walnuts. And so it's not just a wild species that we could one day make use of. It's actually daily already used in agriculture as a wild plant because its roots are much more resistant to pests and diseases that the cultivated scion, or the cultivated top part, is not resistant to. And so this group of folks is each in their own part of the United States and North America, looking at the species around and trying to collect and conserve them in the gardens and make sure they're available to plant breeders and others. Another group that we're working on here in California are prunus, which are plums, apricots, almond group. And there's lots of diversity of, interestingly, of really rare types of prunus here in California. So for instance, there's one out in the desert that's just in the Mojave National Preserve, obviously extremely drought tolerant, heat tolerant, really neat little peach, if you will. And then another one that occurs just on the Central Coast, kind of around Point Conception, that's also extremely rare.
Now, I heard that you also do some work on grapes. So can you share a little bit about San Diego Botanic Garden's conservation gap analysis for wild North American grapes?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. Okay, so grapes, as I started to introduce around these fruits and nuts, grapes are tremendously diverse in the United States and in North America. This group is, so grapes is the genus Vitis, and there are many, many dozens of species, perhaps let's say 80 or 90 species around the world. They really occur in two different places. They occur in East Asia, many dozens of species, and then in North America. Strangely, there was only one species that was really around in Europe, West Asia, and that is the species that was domesticated into the most common one around the world that is eaten as table grapes and wine, Vitis vinifera. That was an outlier. It was like one species there. And then if you think about the whole diversity in that group, these are very edible, very interesting. All of them, it's really in Asia and really here. And so here we have our eaten native grapes that have been for hundreds of years consumed by people and also turned into wines. And then there's native cousins that are not so consumed by people, but are our cousins and have their own value. And again, like the juglans, many of them can be used as rootstocks. There's an important example here where the European wine grape industry almost disappeared actually a couple hundred years ago because of the introduction of a pest called phylloxera in grapes that many people may have heard of if you're interested in grape cultivation or a wine connoisseur. Phylloxera is actually a disease that comes from North America and was accidentally imported into Europe and was just destroying the native, the cultivated native grape there, Vitis vinifera. And the solution to that was introducing, so this is a disease that primarily affects the soil. The solution to that was bringing in native grape species from North America that were already just by nature of natural selection resistant to that disease, and then grafting those varieties of European grapes on top of them. And so still the most common 3 or 4 grape graft stocks or root stocks in the world are Native American wild grape species. And so very important, used every day around the world. And so really, like, modern agriculture is very often this interesting mixture of drawing on not just one species, as we think about actually multiple species. In grapes, it gets even wilder. There can be mixtures of grape species to have the fruit type on top and mixtures of grape species to have the rootstock on bottom. And it's very complex and diverse. And that is actually what modern agriculture is, is, is using to have productive varieties. And then those varieties are always changing over time because of new pests and diseases and changes in heat and all that stuff. And so there's this constant turnover. And so what we're doing as part of a group of researchers here in North America is trying to wrap our heads around what are the species of wild grapes that are here in North America. It's still actually not known completely what all the species are. And so there's basic botanical, taxonomic, and systematic work there, identifying and determining them. And then once we know that, learning where they live and how threatened they are in their wild habitats or not. Many of them are weedy and they're doing just fine. Others are really disappearing. And then learning if we need more protection, for instance, in Forest Service lands or national parks, just for those folks who manage those lands to be more aware of those species so that they don't accidentally eradicate them, for instance. And then also for the seed banks and botanic gardens of the world, have we already have samples of those growing so that we can protect them off-site, what we call ex situ conservation, out of their natural areas so that they're around and more protected, but also available for plant breeding. And so this gap analysis is exactly that question of what is the gap between what's out there in the world and what we have in conservation systems. And we're trying to reduce that gap so that we know that these species are very well conserved into the future.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the plant breeding process and also what you mean by grafting and what that involves?
Yeah, sure. So the plant breeding process is a human endeavor that has gone back for hundreds and thousands of years. It's the process of people noticing interesting traits in plants and selecting for them, and then eventually making educated guesses about which parents they can bring together to create children that would have traits like bigger fruits or fruits that don't fall off the vine as easily so that less waste happens. That is plant breeding in essence. And that endeavor has certainly changed over time. It's gone from being a strictly farmer-based endeavor into also being lots of scientists and researchers and companies fully dedicated to that work now. But in essence, it's still that same endeavor. It's just bringing in a lot of new science and in the last few decades, especially new information on the genetics of the plants themselves and the ability to move genes around in a much more targeted or faster way than in past ways of just marrying the parents together and looking for children that have the traits one needs. What was your second question?
The second part was if you could explain a little bit more about grafting.
Grafting, thank you. Yeah. So if you ever look at a tree, a fruit tree, you might notice towards the base that as the trunk goes down, it suddenly widens out. And if that's true, like a very noticeable change in widening, that might be a tree that's grafted. And that grafting is the connecting of actually two different plants or more into one living organism, one living plant. And so typically what that is at the bottom, there is the plant that basically has a trunk and then roots. And that's desirable because those roots are really great at growing that type of soil or that kind of water, or with the diseases that are in those soils. But maybe it doesn't have the best kind of fruit. And so what agriculture has done, what grafters have done, is they take that root, they cut it off at the base, and then they graft on top. They connect a variety on top that's really great fruit. And so you have the best of both worlds. You have something that works within the soil system and something that works within the above ground system, which is what we want. And there are hobby farmers, gardeners that get into this that will graft on the same apple top, not only just have one type, but dozens even of apples on the same tree. And so each branch essentially eventually becomes a different variety. And so it gets weird and wacky. In horticulture now, even, so not just in trees, very commonly like eggplants and even tomatoes and other plants are also grafted now that are in greenhouse production. And so it takes work. You have to have the expertise to do it, but it basically speeds up production, and it allows some important things like resistance to soil pests while also having great fruits.
Cool, that's really neat. I think the average person might not have heard about what that process entails, so it's kind of cool to hear more about that. So how does San Diego Botanic Garden collaborate with more global organizations? So if we start to zoom out a little bit, what about organizations like the World Vegetable Center and the Global Crop Diversity Trust? Could you tell me a little bit about those and how you work with them?
Sure thing. Yeah. I do think that largely those who are working in conservation or in science, we're really past the period where we think that we can change the world just ourselves, and really realizing that we're in this together, and that the strongest way to really get to the outcomes that we're hoping for is to work together. And at that international level, there is a really established broad network that has been going on for many decades out of international or global efforts like the United Nations that have been getting or trying to get countries to work together for over 70 years, that are working on issues like food and agriculture. And so well, there's a hot spot of organizations that are connected to the United Nations that are in Rome in Italy, which is a wonderful place to work on food and agriculture since they have such a wonderful food tradition in Italy itself. And those organizations, like the Food and Agriculture Organizations of the United Nations, are bringing together countries to work together on issues of food security, of malnutrition, of conservation of this diversity, and others. Around that, there's also a network around the world of organizations that are providing technical assistance regionally for countries or for regions, how to grow food better or more sustainably. And that system includes organizations like the World Vegetable Center that's located in Southeast Asia, and the organization that I worked for many years that's in Colombia called the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. And they grew up also about 60 or 70 years ago originally around the idea that wealthier countries really were developing and knew how to do technical assistance, basically agricultural extension for their constituents, but there were other parts of the world that really didn't have that funding or support. And so there should be these international organizations that would be providing technical assistance. They also were the hotspots of the giant movement called the Green Revolution that has happened also in the last, well, basically 50, 70 years, which was in very short, the development of whole new varieties that could produce a lot more food also typically needed a lot more fertilizer and chemical inputs and caused a series of unintended social and environmental impacts. And so those organizations were very important in pushing out those varieties and feeding the world in a much bigger way, but also then needed to grapple with all of the effects. And so those organizations have really started to focus much more now on issues of environment, of social inequities, gender, things like that that are really important within agriculture. And so our garden also plays a role of connecting to those international organizations and supporting this larger process of organizations that are interested in making sure that people are fed sustainably, and we learn, or we're learning hopefully how to do that in better ways. And in my own work, or our own work here in particular, on making sure that the diversity that allows people to be fed more sustainably is known about, is around. And I mean diversity in plants, also in people. So for instance, we've worked on understanding chili peppers and all of the different varieties out there in the world, and who grows them and who's breeding them, and which ones are disappearing. And that kind of scientific research comes together so that folks can, researchers, but also policymakers can make decisions about where they're going to focus monies or personnel, so that they can conserve those varieties or develop new varieties, make sure that they're around in national seed banks and other work like that.
Are there any other types of programs or information you'd like to share about the work San Diego Botanic Garden is doing or working on in collaboration with other organizations?
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I know that this podcast is in another part of the country, but I'd like to say that my favorite way of interacting and talking is in person. And so if you ever come out to Southern California, please come and visit us. There is a lot of information online on our website about what we do, but also if you're interested in botanic gardens, the best and first way would be to visit your local botanic garden. And again, there's hundreds around the country. And so it's usually within a couple hours drive of almost anybody, there's a botanic garden. And there's some organizations and websites that connect the gardens together. One is called the American Public Gardens Association that you might check out. And another that's more global is called Botanic Gardens Conservation International. And those will lead you to a lot of these global efforts that connect all of us around sustainability and food and other issues.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely encourage people to visit their local botanic garden. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today. It was really exciting to hear about all the things that you're working on. Thank you so much.
My sincere pleasure. Thank you.